Hello Funkers, and welcome back to part 3 of Jagaaan, the toxic beauty of desire, where I'll finally break down the most important lesson of this manga. Did Chiharu prove that mindless self-indulgence would bring about freedom? What do half-fractured humans and fully fractured humans represent in the real world? And what element was Chiharu missing in his desire for an interesting world? We'll uncover all of the answers to these questions and more, but as always, let's first understand a few basics relevant to the topic at hand. Let's talk about desire first. As we all know, within the Jagaaan manga, characters who have been bonded with frenzied frogs, froglets, and tadpoles alike are able to use superhuman powers as long as they are working towards a desire of theirs. But how do we define desire in the first place? I mean, isn't that a vague concept to define? And yes, it absolutely is, but the devil's in the details, and the sooner we understand the facets of desire, the sooner we can uncover the overall message behind this manga. So what is desire exactly? Desires are a set of emotions and states of mind that drive action, or at the very least, coax it. In linguistic philosophy, desire is often described as a propositional attitude with the intent to achieve a conceivable state of affairs. Now, I know that's a lot of jargon speak for something that could be chalked up to, I want good stuff and I want bad stuff. But the nuance behind these terms is actually quite crucial, and you'll see why. And once broken down, they don't seem so convoluted, believe me. So let's start off by dissecting what a propositional attitude is. A propositional attitude is the smallest base unit of thought or belief. It's like the meter or foot for Americans of the thinking world. Let's think about a hypothetical belief that measures 1 unit tall and 1 unit wide. An example here is squares have corners. Squares have corners is an example of such a belief because it has a subject. In this case, that subject being a square, and a belief regarding that subject being that they have corners. This is considered a propositional attitude because there isn't much information that could complicate this simple belief. For example, one could test this belief by seeing if squares have corners or not, and bam, you get your answer. A belief such as chocolate is better than vanilla, however, is not considered a propositional attitude because more information is needed in order to prove or disprove this belief, thus making this belief larger than 1 by 1 units. Okay, cool. So what about a state of affairs? A state of affairs is the unit that qualifies the given proposition. In other words, it's the way the world has to be in order to make the proposition a reality. If we go back to our belief that squares have corners, the state of affairs in our current universe is that squares, in fact, do have corners. If the belief was squares are round, then the state of affairs would be false and therefore incompatible with the propositional attitude, and thus cause us to find a new proposition to match the state of affairs. We'd have to find the right puzzle piece, so to speak, in order to make the current state of affairs be congruent with our thought. So we'd have to say circles are round, and voila, we have ourselves a propositional attitude that achieves a conceivable state of affairs. Alright, so let me explain how desires fall under this formula. Let's think of a desire most people in the West have, being, I want to be rich. If we extrapolate this phrase into its raw meaning, it would look like this. I need a lot of money in order to be happy. The I need a lot of money part is the propositional attitude, and in order to be happy is the current state of affairs. In every desire, the state of affairs will not match the actual state of affairs, aka reality. Otherwise, it would be a fact and not so much a desire. It's obvious that by using philosophical linguistics, we can view desire as the fight between reality and will or want, where any reality that does not match will is automatically desire. Alright, so far pretty simple, right? Chiharu would certainly think so, and he would chalk it up pretty much just the same way. Chiharu's obsession with desire and his need to overcome the societal structures of the world through selfishness stems from the belief that there are haves and have-nots in the world, and the nots exist to become haves, so to speak, this being his personal goal in life. And well, every human being defines their purpose in their world according to their own backgrounds. So for example, some want to become doctors to help other people, some want to become CEOs to gain admiration and money, others want to be professional athletes and break records, others want to be parents and raise the next generation, and so on and so forth. Whatever these specific life goals may be, however, They all try to bridge the gap between the propositional attitude and the current state of affairs, the haves versus the have-nots. So if every human being is trying to bridge this gap and thus succumb to their desires, then what's Chiharu's point in causing people to become selfish if people are already inherently selfish? Well, you see, Chiharu has been doing a really good job of defining for us what kinds of selfishness he likes and which ones he sees boring. From all of the examples we have seen thus far, we can assume that Chiharu is familiar with Epicurus's philosophy of desire. Let's break down desire even more and uncover the spectrum that Epicurus has developed in order to explain the different kinds of desires humans have and which ones Chiharu hails as true selfishness. Epicurus was an ancient Greek philosopher born in 341 BC who founded the school of thought known as Epicureanism. I know, not very creative. This school of thought was developed to challenge Stoicism directly as a means to promote a pleasurable life. Now, unlike hedonism, which promotes pleasure at all costs and hails the avoidance of pain in the pursuit of happiness as the meaning of life, Epicureanism defines which ways of pleasure seeking are acceptable and which ones aren't. Epicurus still preached that the avoidance of pain and the pursuit of happiness were integral, but he made sure to define the three different types of desires we may have when pursuing happiness, two of which he considered unnecessary and counterproductive to our own well-being and happiness. He split up desires into the following categories. The first category is the natural and necessary desires. These desires are our most basic and ingrained desires that exist solely as a feedback loop so that we may not die or experience physical pain and mental agony. These desires include the desire to eat, drink, clothe ourselves, avoid isolation, learn useful skills, exercise, etc. This rung of our desires is basically essential for our survival as individuals. The second category are the natural and unnecessary desires. These desires are also very animalistic by nature and are ingrained in our DNA. However, they are not essential for our own survival. These desires include tasty food, sex, entertainment, acquisition of goods, etc. And then the third category are the vain and empty desires. These desires are not biologically ingrained into our DNA, but are driven by the same processes that compose our feedback loops as a whole. They include fame, status, power, admiration, wealth, and the realization of a vision. Epicurus preached that unlike Stoicism that taught that endurance would bring fulfillment and that by experiencing adversity with fortitude, the inevitable nicer sides of life would bring one joy, Epicureanism would accomplish a happy and fulfilled life by clinging only to one's natural and necessary desires. By not pursuing any desire that existed outside of the realm of necessity, one could achieve tranquility and serenity similar to Buddhist teachings of atomism. But in order to draw a stronger parallel, allow me to share this quote from the Dhamma Wheel Forum, a discussion forum about Buddhist values. In the Epicurean way, the highest pleasure, that being tranquility and freedom from fear, was obtained by knowledge, friendship, and living a virtuous and temperate life. He lauded the enjoyment of simple pleasures, by which he meant abstaining from bodily desires such as sex and appetites, verging on asceticism. He argued that when eating, one should not eat too richly, for it could lead to dissatisfaction later, such as the grim realization that one could not afford such delicacies in the future. Likewise, sex could lead to increased lust and dissatisfaction with the sexual partner. End quote. Thus we can see how Epicureanism seems to be the love child of Stoicism, Buddhism, and hedonism, all wrapped up in a boring and moderate blanket. But what do these distinctions say about Chiharu's obsession with desire and selfishness? Well, they tell us that, to Chiharu at least, true selfishness stems from adherence to one's natural and unnecessary desires. Since Chiharu's ultimate goal in causing chaos was to create a free and interesting world of self-serving individuals, we can see that Chiharu does make the distinction between the three types of desires and only legitimizes the second kind of desire, because it transcends what to him is considered selfless and necessary, thus breaking the systems of human conformity to society. At this point, you're probably thinking, Tony, it almost seems then that Chiharu was right all along, and that the core of society's woes was only sticking to their natural and necessary desires. And from this particular lens, I would say, yeah, you're absolutely correct. Though we never get an explanation as to why the frenzied frogs entered Bupa City to begin with, we can see why their existence was needed as a way to get society away from Epicureanism and reward unnatural desires with unlimited power. There's no disagreeing there, and in fact, I'll even give Chiharu a gold star in pointing that out. But even all three of these different kinds of desires can be put on a spectrum. And don't take it from me. Take it from the manga, because as we all know, there's a big difference between a fully fractured human, who's all power and no reason, and a half-fractured human, who can navigate between their desire and their reason. We'll get into that a little bit later. So, in philosophy, how would we even put these different kinds of desires on a spectrum? Well, Aristotle would define it as the difference between volition and appetition. Volition being a rational justification for us acting upon our desires, and appetition being the sensation that we get to fulfill these desires. Think of it as just appetite, where we involuntarily feel like we need to eat when we get hungry, or crave something yummy in our tummy. Aristotle described these differences as such though. Quote, "Everything too is pleasant, for which we have the desire within us, since desire is the craving for pleasure. Of the desires, some are rational, and some are associated with reason. By irrational I mean those which do not arise from any opinion held by the mind. Of this are those known as natural. For instance, those originating in the body, such as the desire for nourishment, namely hunger and thirst, and a separate kind of desire answering to each kind of nourishment, and the desires connected with taste and sex and sensations of touch in general, and those of smell, hearing, and vision. Rational desires are those which we are induced to have. There are many things we desire to see or get because we have been told of them and induced to believe them good." End quote. We're going to be comparing the actions of characters who represent different points on the spectrum of desire between actions done through volition and appetition. But before we do that, let's define volition in its most scientific and objective form. Modern conceptions of volition address it as a process of conscious action control which becomes automatized, according to experts in the field of cognition. We can then assume that deciding to go to school or work in the morning is an act of volition, because although we take the action for granted, we automatically rationalize that it is in our best interest to do the activity, thus muddying the waters of desire, because it adds an uncomfortable step in between us and our goals. But there is more to volition than our ability to undergo sacrifice and barter to achieve what we desire. Volition is directly linked to the strength of our beliefs, values, and a concept known as self-efficacy. Self-efficacy can be viewed as one's belief to accomplish certain tasks, and with the right amount can push someone to do things outside of their comfort level. For example, someone who believes that they are bad at math will avoid undergoing careers that are math heavy because of the fear that they will fail the task, whereas a similarly competent person who believes they are either alright at math or good at it will become more prone to take up those careers in order to acquire their monetary incentives. We'll assume that in both cases, both individuals value money, and the individual with low self-efficacy would rather opt to find an alternative to making money that aligns more with what they believe to be easier and in line with their skill sets, i.e., robbing a bank. So in short, people with low self-efficacy will avoid challenges in life and will put less effort into developing new skills because they believe that they are incapable of doing so. What's fascinating in all of this is that there is a correlation between chasing appetite and having low self-efficacy, meaning that people who succumb to their desires fight less for the things that they want. It seems like a paradox, but the reality is that desires are for the most part universally as powerful across all walks of life. A person's inability to delay short-term desire in order to gain a far greater reward then is not linked to some inherent lack of willpower, but by low self-efficacy. By now we're starting to paint a really interesting picture of what fully fractured humans represent in the real world, but I'm not done yet. Let's first make the assumption that myopic selfishness, that being what Chiharu preaches throughout the manga as a means to destroy the predictability of the game of life, is the way to go, and anything outside of short-sightedness and selfish behavior represents compliance. Okay then, under this assumption we're led to believe that Chiharu is less an agent of chaos and more akin to a philosophical hedonist. But when we start to break down his actions in relation to other characters, we realize that Chiharu is actually both very wrong about his supposition and also a fucking hypocrite. Let's analyze the following characters seen here: Robochan the rapist, our conflicted protagonist Jagaaan, the ethical guardian Misogyny, and our static catalyst Chiharu. Let's start off with Robochan. When we follow Robochan's story, we initially meet him as a shy, introverted, and quiet kid who had spent the majority of his life being overlooked or forgotten. As we get to understand him more and more, we realize that he's a pervert who resorts to installing cameras in girls' rooms because of his belief that nobody would ever want to get laid with him. We see that he has a low self-efficacy belief regarding his ability to be liked by women. This leads him to pursue his desire to get laid, a desire that is not uncommon with people in his age range, to turn him into a techie stalker in order to obtain some form of release. I would argue that it takes a higher level of agency to become an expert in espionage than to actually walk up to a girl and initiate a conversation. But that's the thing about Robochan. His level of self-efficacy is lacking in the social department, which is why he resorts to something that could be arguably more difficult in order to reach his preferred state of affairs, aka his goal to see a particular girl's titties. Despite that, stalking girls by installing video cameras in their rooms is not considered to be an act of volition, according to Aristotle, but an act of appetition, because Robochan himself deems his actions to be coming from a need to feel sexual satisfaction and not for some undisclosed greater good. Now let's categorize his desire using both Epicurus' list of desires and Aristotle's spectrum of cognition for his desires. Since Robochan's desires to be close to someone in an intimate fashion, we can categorize it as his desire for sex, thus placing him in the natural and unnecessary desires column. But what level of purpose is his desire representative of? Well, because Robochan shows the ability to premeditate his actions and shows high self-efficacy in the realms of espionage, but knows that his actions only serve the purpose of filling the empty void in his heart, we can say that he's led by appetite, therefore putting him at the appetition side of the scale. Alright, now it's Jagaan's turn. Jagaaan, we see, is basically a pussy whose entire life is led by restraint. Jagaan's desire for violence does not make him a violent individual, but does cause him to follow the rules of the game and choose one of the few professions that can allow him to legally pursue his desire to kill people. He shows high self-efficacy by undergoing the training necessary to live a life as a cop. We realize early in the manga that Jagaaan doesn't actually have a desire to have a stable career and live out a predictable life with his late girlfriend Yuriko, but rather wants to live in an exciting life as a cop who gets to shoot up all of the people who make him angry. We learn that Jagaaan doesn't really encompass the serve the community archetype of a cop either, by being unable to communicate openly to the civilians of Bupa City, but rather put on a charade of a happy-go-lucky cop. Jagaan's career choice as a cop, though not really conductive in helping him achieve his desires to murder, at least approximates to that within the confines of acceptable occupations in Japanese society. His ability to stick to his profession in the hopes of one day seeing action is evidence for his high self-efficacy, and as such, we can say that Jagaan's desire is being channeled through his volition instead of his appetition. But ultimately, when we categorize his intentions, we realize that Jagaaan is restraining his appetite to kill. This desire being considered an appetite because even Jagaaan knows himself that murder is wrong and shows virtue by stopping himself from committing it. Categorizing his desire then, we'll say that Jagaan's desire to act on his aggression was a natural and unnecessary desire. It did take some deliberation, however, to figure out whether or not wanting to shoot somebody would be considered natural, but aggression in varying degrees is a natural reaction to stress, albeit not a good one. So yeah, as we can see, despite us considering Jagaaan a good guy and Robochan a bad guy, we can see how both of them are actually compelled by the same type of desires, and the same level of cognizance behind them. Their only difference being Jagaan's ability to see past his appetite in stopping himself from killing people without reason. Now that we see that by the end of the Jagaaan manga, Jagaaan embraces his natural and unnecessary desires through appetition, do we see why Chiharu joins forces with him in the end? Because Jagaaan eventually becomes the purest version of a myopic, selfish hedonist.
What a twist!
When we look at Misogyny now, we see a larger-than-life Captain America type of person whose perceived selflessness drives him to protect others and make sure that his worldview of a peaceful and protected populace comes true. Misogyny goes so far as ousting himself as a transparent and well-known superhero when he forms the superhero team Triple H, his desire having been stated to be an innate compulsion for justice. Not that justice of vengeance, however, like Batman's, but the type of justice that serves to encourage people to do better and to not commit needless crimes. Misogi took this philosophy to another level when he invested Triple H funds to develop a generic dung ball that would serve as a dampener for people who had bonded with frenzied frogs. We can therefore see that Misogi was being guided through a sense of altruism to accomplish all of these positive goals. Altruism being a trademark of volition because it in of itself is a work that exists to achieve a common good without appealing to the seductive powers of selfish desires. Things become interesting when we start to categorize Misogi's desires on the Epicurean categorization system. Though working to achieve world peace, or at the very least peace within Bupa City, is a noble task, it does not constitute as a natural and necessary desire. The reason for that is because Epicurus taught that in order to achieve maximum satisfaction and not fall prey to unmet expectations, one must indulge in only basic survival desires and moderate the amount of pleasure one receives from them. Though world peace is important, it is not conducive for an individual to survive. Helping others is important, but just like nurses and doctors who develop compassion fatigue, one can also develop a sense of failure by tasting small victories in the realm of altruism, but ultimately falling short and feeling pain when one's unrealistic expectations are not met. This is exactly why Misogi became a fully fractured human during the Bupa City mass fracturing event, because he had made large strides in securing a peaceful future for Bupa City, only to witness his most deeply rooted desire crumble in front of him, thus causing him to lose control and put matters into his own hands, first by killing himself out of shame, and immediately after losing control of his volition to fix the situation. So, with this in mind, we can see how, according to Epicurus, Misogi's desire was vain because he was striving to accomplish a personal ideal of his, but he was working towards his vanity through volition instead of appetition. That is, until Chiharu broke him in his own attempts to prove that anything other than myopic selfish desires were uninteresting and counterproductive to the creation of a more free and dynamic world. Speaking of Chiharu, let's talk a little bit about his desire for chaos through the use of selfishness. Chiharu, we know, had been critical of Jagaaan throughout the beginning of the manga, having stated that he was boring for trying to revive Yuriko, a desire that evidently seemed too selfless to him. His inhibition of people's appetition and dismissal of those who worked through volition, such as people like Misogi and later on Nomen's Nomen, when he went full human instrumentality on us, made us really believe that he was all about this part of the desire matrix. Think about it. If all he had been preaching was following one's true desires at all costs necessary, we could see how that fits in with Aristotle's definition of appetition, a desire that only exists to fulfill one's own urges and nothing else. We can also see how Chiharu encourages natural and unnecessary desires through the creation of Debtorland's vetting process, where people of all walks of life could simply go, tell them what they've been itching to achieve, and be rewarded to chase these desires. Yukimaru being a prime example of that, who went to Debtorland wanting to exact revenge on Jagaaan for his indirect involvement of his grandfather's death. Revenge being a natural and unnecessary desire. So if Chiharu's philosophy finds himself praising people who cater to natural and unnecessary desires through their own appetition, why the fuck does he constantly end up at odds with Jagaaan throughout the story? In order to find this out, let's map Chiharu's desires on the desire matrix. Okay, so a desire to cause chaos isn't natural nor necessary because people don't need chaos in the world as a minimum requirement to live life. And well, it isn't a natural nor unnecessary desire either, like sex or anger or money. So is it vain? And the answer is absolutely. Chiharu's vision for a future where the entire world breaks the game of life, disregards politeness, acts with selfishness, and essentially causes unabated chaos is an idealist delusion meant to give Chiharu a sense of satisfaction that he had caused the world to become better. Though to many, this type of world isn't what one would consider an altruistic cause, but for Chiharu, it is. Breaking the system of societal control is what Chiharu envisions to be a perfect world. So, when we chart Chiharu's desire, we see that he is both vain and acts through volition, much like Misogi, and unlike Jagaaan, who becomes the complete opposite of Chiharu by the end of the manga. So now that we see that Jagaaan shares more in common with Robochan the rapist, and Chiharu shares more in common with Misogi the altruistic superhero, what can we say about the message behind Jagaaan? What's the overall lesson here? No matter which way you slice it, we as human beings will never be able to get rid of our desires. The great Buddha himself has advocated against craving, but never desire. Because in desire therein lies our true human potential. There have been several philosophies that attempt to either exalt or dampen the power of our desires, Stoicism and hedonism to name a couple. But when we look into the world around us and realize every human achievement, both good and bad, we see that there was a level of desire behind them. Jagaaan isn't the protagonist because he was a paragon and had pure desires to make the world a better place. Jagaaan is the protagonist because he made the world a better place despite his desire to murder and cause damage to other people, whereas Chiharu, who had good intentions to free the world from societal control, ended up causing unimaginable hurt, pain, and death, and eventually created a monster that was opposed to his perceived philosophy of selfishness in the form of the insanely powerful half-fractured human Nomen's Nomen. So why exactly was Chiharu wrong? You see, Chiharu was wrong in his assessment that pure selfishness would free the world because he didn't understand one important component of accomplishing one's selfish goals. It's a concept that we've actually been talking about this entire time, from part 1 to part 3, without ever mentioning its name, and that's discipline. Discipline is the harness for all desires, necessary, unnecessary, vain, appetite-based, and volition-based, and without it, one truly does become fractured. Chiharu's hypocrisy in his beliefs stemmed from the fact that he believed that what made a human truly free was their adherence to their appetite, since the pursuit of immediate pleasures emulated chaos. What he didn't understand, however, was that what made people successful in achieving their selfish desires was not the type of desire nor its strength, but the discipline one had to accomplish said desires. Without discipline, desire is nothing more than a wish. One who desires to be wealthy without discipline will never ever resolve that appetite. That is what Chiharu was missing in his philosophy, and if we go back and look at our desire matrix, we'll see that though everyone on it is on different ends of these matrices, they're all, shocker, just half-fractured humans. So what induces one to become a fractured human if the type of desire clearly doesn't cause the fracturing? Well, in chapter 34, we see misogyny explain how frenzied frogs, froglets, and tadpoles choose their hosts, and we get an interesting answer to this question. A strong desire is what draws the frog to the host, but what keeps the host from fracturing completely during their incubation period is, the amount of control one has over their desires, aka their discipline. That's the real lesson behind Jagaaan. Chiharu was almost right in believing that desire was powerful enough to break the chains of monotony and create a dynamic society capable of living to achieve its own desires. But without it, we'd become slaves to a higher master. Without the use of a frenzied frog, we'd labor for someone else, follow rules that society implemented on us, and become predictable cogs in the machine we call society. Now, with a frenzied frog, however, our desire would overcome our reason, and we'd become slaves to the flame inside of us, unable to work towards our desire. In fact, notice how despite desire being the source of a fractured human's immense power, no fully fractured human ever even came close to accomplishing their desires. That's Kaneshiro Muneyuki's ultimate lesson. Desire is not bad nor destructive. I mean, even Jagaan's desire for bloodlust was given good use when it was in conjunction with his discipline and discretion. Desire without discipline, however, is pointless and does nothing for us other than makes us slaves to someone else or something else. Now, just to humor Chiharu a little bit, imagine what the real world would look like if everyone had the discipline to follow their desires. I don't know about you, but I'm sure both Chiharu and I would find it quite interesting.